Welcome to Hope for Anxiety and OCD, episode 13. Today I'm sharing an interview with author Mitzi VanCleve. She shares her own personal journey of diagnosis, treatment, and interactions with the church in regards to dealing with panic attacks, anxiety, and OCD. I found her story to be incredibly hopeful in terms of how we can grow closer to God through struggles in our lives. So let's dive in. When did you start to have symptoms of OCD?
Well, that really started even as far back as when I was a toddler. I know that sounds surprising. The only thing I can say about that is in my childhood and right up until I was quite old, actually, I never understood a lot of what I was experiencing was actually OCD. So like the first things that I can go back and look at as really long held obsessional fears and themes. The very first one was it was sort of unusual, as OCD themes are.
Sure.
It was a fear of being flushed down the toilet. And this fear was so intense that I would not use the big toilet until I was 5 years old and I was forced to go to kindergarten.
Wow.
And even as a small child, you're 3 years old, 4 years old, I could sit there and watch a toilet being flushed, look at the hole in the bottom of the toilet and say, well, I can't fit through there.
Mm-hmm.
But it didn't make any difference. My brain had just decided this was a thing to be afraid of. And from there, once I got past that one, there was health obsessions. I remember a really long period of time where I heard about the idea of swallowing your tongue. And that just drove me nuts. I mean, I thought about it and worried about it, wondered how that could happen, asked my parents about it, and it would just, I would forget about it while I was playing. Then when I go to bed at night, it would come back. And that's when I would really struggle, was like at times like that when I didn't have anything to do. And so there was a lot of those kind of weird themes and health obsessions. But by the age of 10, is when I first developed some obsessions related to self-harm. And that just started with hearing about a form of not self-harm, but just a form of harm that could happen to a person. And, I don't want to really go into the details. Sometimes it's a little bit hard to explain specific obsessions in details because it can get a little graphic and upsetting, and people who don't have OCD don't really understand.
Sure.
Well, why would you think that? And so this morphed from my fear of this thing happening to me actually doing it to myself, like losing control and harming myself. And that just went on and on and on for the longest time. And there was something in me that knew these things weren't at all logical.
Right.
And so they scared me so much, I wouldn't really tell my parents. I would exhibit symptoms of anxiety. I would have nausea. I would get up in the night shaking and feeling like I needed to, vomit and things like that. But I just was afraid to, especially about the harming thing, I was afraid to verbalize that as a kid. But that's where it started. And then it became more debilitating after the birth of my children. And after the birth of my second child, I developed panic disorder, not knowing what that was.
Wow.
I mean, I'd always struggled with like social anxiety and just your basic kinds of anxiety disorders as a kid, but I didn't know such a thing existed.
Right.
I never heard about OCD, anxiety disorders, panic disorder. Those words were foreign to me, spoken. I only heard about crazy people, and there's a thing where there's a stigma, and even as a child, the stigma was there that the idea that I might be crazy was terrifying to me. And so when the panic attacks started, that felt like I was going crazy. And my first one was nocturnal. I was falling asleep and I woke up with a panic attack.
Mm-hmm.
And that happened to me a lot. It still does sometimes.
Yeah.
I just know what it is now.
Mm-hmm.
But that combined with that old harming obsession, the panic attack, the feeling of I'm losing my mind, I'm losing control, the derealization, the depersonalization that you feel at that moment makes you feel like you aren't going to be able to control yourself. That combined with the harming themes, but after the birth of my children, the harming theme switched from me hurting me to me going crazy and possibly hurting one of my children in a really awful way. And that was just so debilitating. I can't even begin to describe how awful it was.
And that's the hard thing about OCD is that the themes do shift as you get older or go through different developmental stages in life. And it seems like once you have a handle on one theme, sometimes another theme will then pop up.
Oh, yes. It's very true about OCD. And that's why it's important to understand how the disorder operates, how to get on top of a theme before it gets on top of you and it grows too big and large. It gets kind of stuck in your head. And so, with that, I do try to tell people that there's physical symptoms with this too when you're going through this. And for me, some of the things I experienced during that really bad season, which was a very long season of harm OCD, was an inability to eat. I struggled to get calories down. I'm 5'8". I dropped to 114 pounds.
Wow.
People thought I was anorexic. It had nothing to do with anorexia. I just was nauseous. The anxiety was so bad. I couldn't sleep. And of course, if you have an anxiety disorder and you're not eating and you're not sleeping, that makes things even worse because that level of physical stress on your body is going to make the disorder worse. So that was what it was like and how it was like for me before I knew what was wrong.
I'm curious about what your parents thought. Did your parents just think like, oh, she's really nervous a lot, or she's kind of an anxious child? They had no idea everything that was going on in your head, right?
They didn't. And, there were some people in my family, distant relatives, who had struggles which caused them to even not want to leave their house and things like that. My mom would talk about that, and she would say, you're gonna end up like that. But she didn't really know what was going on. There was a lot of I know with my mom, there was reassurances, which is a knee-jerk reaction for a parent to do that. But yeah, and a lot of times it manifested just as me being sickly. When I was struggling with certain health obsessions, I would get just like I described, sick to my stomach, and I would lose weight. And so they were taking me to the doctor and trying to figure out what was wrong. But it was being approached like it was a physical issue, and a lot of that's just due to the fact that I didn't verbalize a lot of the OCD themes, but even if I had, I'm not sure there would have been enough knowledge back then for my parents to know why and what was going on, because that was in the 60s, when I was growing up, and I think the information and knowledge and understanding about what OCD is and how it operates is come a long ways since then.
Right. And hopefully also our physicians and pediatricians are also able to recognize a little bit better when they're seeing some symptoms that potentially could be anxiety in a child, which often presents more as physical ailments.
I will share that when I got really, really bad with the harming OCD and the panic attacks, they were just relentless. And I lost count. I have no idea how many I would have in a day or in the evening. And at that point, I did open up to my mom. I began to know, okay, this obviously is something to do with like a mental health issue. And so all I could think of was, I probably need to see a psychiatrist. And so I needed to share that with somebody. I talked to my husband very little about it, just a little bit. And I opened up with my mom. And being growing up as a Christian, and a lot of Christians, there was that stigma, and especially back then, that Christians don't have mental health issues.
Right.
And so as I was sharing to her, I thought it might be a good idea for me to see a psychiatrist. She was really upset about it. And she talked about faith, and then she said something that was really hard, about, well, that's just for weak people.
Oh.
And that, and it was hard because it put the brakes on my pursuing that at the time. And I did pursue it still, but I didn't get a diagnosis. The person I saw didn't have any clue.
Okay.
And he was relating things to stress and, again, faith, and it just, I got nowhere.
Okay. So you did see a psychiatrist, but they weren't able to help you at that point.
No, he just, and of course, some of the scary obsessional themes, I didn't verbalize them. I talked about anxiety, and I talked about the panic attacks. I didn't have that word, though. Just, this is what's happening.
Right.
I tried to describe it. So it wasn't a good experience, and it didn't help me, sadly.
Yeah, that's unfortunate when people do reach out for help and then they find somebody that isn't familiar maybe with OCD or doesn't quite know how to help them navigate through that process. So what was that process of getting the help that you needed?
Okay, well, the first help that I got was really for the panic disorder. And that was interesting. I believe that during the time of my praying through this and asking God for help and just feeling so desperate that God came through, at that time, I was still struggling. I was pregnant again. That tells you how long it was. I was still struggling tremendously, and I had become pregnant again. I was about 4 months pregnant. I was at my aunt and uncle's cottage. My husband and my brothers, my family, and my aunts and uncles, they were watching a TV show, which I did not need to watch at that time. It was called Alien. I'm sure you've heard of it. It's the perfect show if you're struggling with anxiety. So I was trying to avoid watching it. So I picked up a Reader's Digest magazine. And the words on the front of the magazine where they show the stories, one of them said, panic. And then it said, it might not be what you think it is. And just the word panic struck a chord with me. So I opened up this magazine and started reading the story of this woman who had panic disorder, and it was me.
Wow.
I mean, I was reading about myself, and they listed all the symptoms of a panic attack, and I had all of them.
Right.
And so I finally had an answer for that. And so at the time I was pregnant, and I really couldn't implement, meds and things like that. And so I just started working on things like breathing techniques. And after I delivered, I started doing really intensive aerobic exercise. I was jogging 4 and 5 miles a day, and gradually getting healthier, which kind of eventually kind of took me into a period where the disorder waned. It wasn't as bad as it had been. But that's when I learned just about panic disorder. I didn't have any idea about OCD. And so that kind of waxed and waned on and off, throughout the rest of my life up until the age of 50.
Right.
Believe it or not.
So I think your story is very similar to other people's in terms of a lot of times there's a big gap between when people start to have symptoms and when they even find out this is actually OCD that I'm experiencing. Because they feel ashamed of the symptoms, they feel ashamed of the thoughts, or they feel like, okay, this sounds really crazy and nobody's going to understand it or believe it, or they're going to lock me up somewhere if I tell someone that I'm having these
yes.
thoughts, especially related to harm.
Yes, what you say about they're going to lock me up somewhere was a genuine fear of mine, because I couldn't understand why I was having the thoughts to start with. And then for me to share that with somebody, all I could think was, well, they're going to be like, okay, you really are dangerous. And then sometimes I would think, well, maybe that would be good, because then my kids will be safe. I mean, that's how awful it is.
Yeah.
You feel this, like your brain is telling you this is something that you should be afraid of. This thought, it's like, I say, it's almost like you have a phobic response to the thoughts that you're having, and you're having to live with them in your head. You can't, like, if it's a spider or something, you can just run away from it. But when it's a thought in your head, it's there,
Right.
and all that you're doing to try to get rid of it makes it worse. And of course it did with me, because I didn't know it was OCD, and I didn't know what to do about it. It was at the age of 50.
Okay. So at the age of 50, yeah. What happened?
Okay, so I had already been struggling. I was going back through a flare of anxiety and panic attacks, because there'd been a lot of stress in our life. And, I'm not going to go into all the details,
sure.
But lots of changes, big life changes. My husband went on disability, moves, just lots of changes, lots of uncertainty. And so I didn't notice it for a while, but it was kind of too late. By the time I did start to say, oh no, I'm going back through this again, I was having panic attacks. I was starting to have obsessions about my health again, related to stuff that normally I would just brush off. But that's how OCD is. It's always looking for a target, something to be upset about. And so during that time, I was praying again, reading my Bible, doing all the things I normally do as a Christian, to try to receive information from God about what can I do about this? How can I help myself? But also just, to gain comfort. And I got a lot of comfort from the Psalms, even back when I was in my 20s, because I saw in there things that described how I was feeling. So my son also gave me some sermons on tape. And he said, these are really good, Mom. we always share things like this. You ought to listen. So I put one of those sermons in. It was actually on a CD, and I was doing dishes. I was trying to stay very busy and distracted. And so this particular pastor was talking about our struggles with sin as Christians. And I understood, it wasn't new to me, that as Christians, we will still be fighting sin our whole life. It's not something that we're cured of. It's something we're aware of.
Right.
We're made aware of when we become a Christian, and we have a desire to please our Savior. So we work continually towards pleasing Him through obedience. But he says this one statement, which I don't even know why he said it. In the middle of this sermon, he says, so if you call yourself a Christian, but you're still all the time struggling and sinning and struggling with sin, you really might want to think, are you really a Christian? In the past, I would have been like, yeah, of course. At this time, my brain just latched onto that. It was like, wait a minute. What if he's right? What if all this time, all these years, I've thought as a Christian I'm not? And what if the reason I struggle with this thing, whatever it is because of that? And it just was like a dam broke open, and the thoughts, the intrusive thoughts related to that just poured out, just one after another. And it was just, I just began this war with it. Right. It was a mental 24/7, every minute I was awake, I couldn't sleep. And that was the new OCD theme, but I didn't know it was OCD.
Because you hadn't ever had that before. It was a new theme.
Until I was engaging with my compulsions. And so by then, at this point in my life, of course, we had the internet, and I was doing what's called researching.
Lots of Googling.
lots of Googling, lots of researching around the topic of, am I still saved? Doubting your salvation. And I was reading all these articles about how we can know we're really Christians, and I would read them and pore over them, and it didn't help. It didn't make it go away. And suddenly one day I stumbled across a Christian forum that said doubting your salvation, then it said OCD. I was like, what does that have to do with what I'm going through? But out of curiosity, I opened it. And I got into this forum, and it was like I started reading the posts from the people in this group, and it was amazing. It was just like the Reader's Digest thing. I was reading my story.
Right.
They were telling exactly what I had been going through. I was stunned. And as I read more and more in this forum, and then I started going further out about OCD, what it is, how it manifests, what causes it, I had it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd had it since I was a kid, and I never knew.
Wow.
And that opened up the door for me to finally have a way to manage this beast called OCD. And from there, I began learning more about ERP, about medications, about therapies like ACT, just all the ways that this thing that I called it, this ugly it, for all these years, it had a name.
Mm-hmm.
And I get tearful sometimes talking about it, because God just, he did answer my prayer.
Right.
He just didn't answer in the way I was wanting. The way I was wanting was just take this thing away, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
And he was pointing me to, this is what it is, and this is what you can do.
Right.
And it was just astonishing to me that I could live my whole life basically until I was 50 years old and never have been able to get help. And there was so many long seasons of just debilitating, crippling suffering. And it was hard for me to believe, but just the relief
right
was so overwhelming.
Yeah. I mean, we talked about that in an earlier episode with someone about how diagnosis itself can be a relief when you get a proper diagnosis. Yes. And then you can say, okay, now that we know what we're dealing with, what can we do about it? What's our next step forward?
Exactly. And, even after you get a diagnosis, because OCD is OCD, it's going to make you doubt that. It's called the doubting disorder.
Sure.
But as you begin to bravely risk working with things like exposure response prevention therapy, and even for me, it was brave when I was told I probably needed to try some medications. Mm-hmm. That was hard for me.
Sure.
Some of that was pride. Some of it was just because I have never taken anything like that before. What will it do to me? All the fears. And, so that was a big struggle, but it's so worth it, because the alternative is staying stuck.
Right.
And doing the same thing over and over and not getting better and feeling worse. And to me, I was determined, just like with the panic disorder, I was like, what can I do about this? And I found out these things are effective. It was just, it was hard. It's not like, oh, you began ERP and the next day it's like, I'm all better.
Right. It's a process.
No, it's a process. And the longer you've been struggling with the theme, I think it's a longer process. Your brain's got this practiced cycle of intrusive thought, anxiety response, compulsion, more intrusive thoughts, more anxiety, more compulsions. And so it's a habit that needs to be undone, and that takes time.
Right. Did you get into therapy at that point?
I started going to a therapist, and, I think this is the hardest thing about OCD and people with a diagnosis, is being able to find a competent therapist is hard. And my therapist was good for dealing with basic anxiety disorders like panic disorder, generalized anxiety, social anxiety. But when it came to OCD, she was asking me to apply your basic cognitive behavioral therapy like you would for like depression, which would be to challenge the thoughts, to counter the thoughts, and to write logical reassurances.
Which is exactly what you don't want to do with OCD. Not a good idea.
So I started doing that, and I got worse. And so I was like, you know what? There was one thing she offered up that was great. And it was, and I still say it today, and it's act as if. And that's part of the choice part of OCD. OCD thoughts may be telling me this and telling me that, but I'm going to act as if these things aren't true. And in the realm of Christianity and scrupulosity, even though my brain was telling me, I think you might be becoming an atheist. Mm-hmm. I could say, I'm going to act as if I'm a Christ follower. I'm going to do all the things that a Christ follower does, even if my emotions will not validate that choice. That is my choice. And so that aspect helped. The other was worse. So I pretty much learned on my own. I did visit some really good websites like OCDonline.com. Dr. Phillipson, a lot of his work was just phenomenal to help me understand. And so I learned about imaginal scripting, imaginal exposures, and I wrote them and did them and recorded them.
Awesome.
And I was able to learn that on my own. But a lot of people really do need a competent therapist because it takes a lot of grit and determination and courage to do ERP. And I just think having a competent psychologist who's trained to do these things and understands the disorder is something, unfortunately, there just aren't that many. A lot of it has to do with your network, with your insurance,
sure,
too, which was one of my biggest hurdles. I could not afford the counselors and the therapists that I needed to see. I had to go to the ones in network. And even later on, when I was going through a bumpy time with my OCD, after I knew what it was, I was just going through a really bumpy time. And I thought, boy, I could sure use someone right now. And my therapist had passed. And I called around and I would ask, or I would write. I know I communicated through email. I would say, what do you know about ERP and ACT as far as treating OCD? And they would say, I don't know what that is.
Oh, wow.
And then they would say, but I can help you with your OCD. And I'll be like, probably not.
Right.
So that's a hard thing. That's a really hard thing.
It is hard because really therapists would have to pursue training after their degree to specialize in OCD. And a lot of people don't do that unless they have some type of personal connection, or in my situation, I was working with a lot of people who just thought they had anxiety. And then I was starting to see more OCD as I was starting to hear more about what they were actually worried about and struggling with. So that's kind of how I got branched off into it. But I think a lot of therapists have not received, further training on it. I want to get in with you on the spiritual aspects, really, of struggling with OCD. And I know a lot of people who are struggling out there probably are praying prayers just like you prayed, like, God, this is awful. I feel terrible. I'm all tore up inside. Will you please just touch my body and touch my mind and take this all away? And how did you work through some of that wrestling with God?
When I didn't know, I had OCD, I did a lot of that, and it was a wrestling time. I thought during that time, maybe this was due to past sins. Maybe there was something I needed to confess, and so I would pour over everything I could think of and current things and confess. For the OCD and the anxiety, I would go through, and I knew these verses, every verse related to worry, anxiety, all of those things. And I had most of that memorized anyway. I did understand what those things meant. What I didn't understand was the difference. So the Bible talks a lot about anxiety and worry, but if you look at those passages of Scripture, you will see these are situational worries and concerns. They're about real life trials and afflictions, it isn't this always there free floating sense of dread and, physical symptoms and everything of anxiety that can even be there when you aren't even worried about anything. It's like panic attacks, for instance. So that was confusing to me, but there was also a feeling, because God wasn't taking it away just miraculously,
right.
that maybe he'd abandoned me. And that's why I say the Psalms, there's particular Psalms, Psalm 13, I think, says, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you keep hiding your face? Please answer me." And just the desperation there of the feeling when we're going through painful suffering and trials of where's God in all of this. And it took a while for me to understand growth through affliction. And that came gradually. There's several aspects of this. There's my own not understanding the difference between commonplace worry that everyone experiences and a disorder, like anxiety disorder, a real mental health issue. That was the biggest hurdle for me to get over, was to learn. So when I learned that I had OCD and I learned I had panic disorder, I was able to shift over into, well, maybe this is how God's answering my prayer.
Right.
And so I was able to see, just like if I had, because I do have hypertension, the answer to that God gave me wasn't to just miraculously heal my hypertension. It was for me to go on medication to treat my hypertension.
Right. Yeah.
And so that helped me to understand that these are very real disorders, and to learn about how they develop, why they develop, how they're genetic. And I see that in my family, that it's definitely genetic, and that it's not a sin to treat a disorder, an affliction, and to seek professional help for it. Now, that was something I had to work through. But when you try to talk about it to other Christians, actually, if you don't know what's going on, but it's a mental health issue, you may not know, like we've talked about how you can have OCD and not know it. So you might be going to a pastor or a Christian friend, and you might talk a little bit about your anxiety disorder. They come at you with what I call mini sermons. And they start quoting you all the verses about anxiety as if you'd never heard them before. And it was, especially when they know you're a Christian, they know you study the Bible, they know that you followed Christ to the best of your ability. It's a very condescending, because they water it down to, well, you just don't know how to not worry because you don't trust God.
Right.
This is a faith issue. If you had more faith. It's even gone so far as, and this is the one that drives me the most nuts, is if you have a mental health issue or anxiety disorder, people will say things to you like, you have a demon.
Oh, no, that's bad.
That sort of thing. That's bad. I mean, this is awful, especially for a person with scrupulosity, religious OCD themes. I mean, that's horrifying.
Yeah.
It just makes it 10 times worse. But, there's this lack of knowledge out there when it comes to understanding these disorders. And I really think anxiety disorders are probably the least understood, because of Bible verses about worry being equated, with an anxiety disorder. And they're not at all the same. And if you're a sufferer, you know the difference. You definitely know the difference. But people who don't have experience or a loved one who they know and see going through this, they just automatically assume, unfortunately, that this is what it is.
Right. And it's hard for pastors and ministry leaders to understand. They don't necessarily have that type of training or clinical background. And sometimes they're dipping toes in the water that they need to kind of stay out of, and just say, definitely we will support you and love you and pray for you, but we also want you to get professional help, because that's important. And God can use those things in your life. God can use therapy and medication. And so these negative experiences that you had with maybe pastors or other people in the church who were well-meaning, let's say, and trying to help you, Did that cause you to want to go public with your story and write a book?
Yes, it really did. It wasn't just that, though, but that was a big part of it. What you just said about, they really don't have the training or the ability to recognize these disorders. I mean, scrupulosity, for instance, if a person is struggling with doubts about their salvation, and maybe this pastor has known this person for most of their life, and they're suddenly in their office and they're going through all these thoughts with them, and then the pastor gives them the reassurance from the scripture, and they're like, okay. And then they come back again and they start saying the same thing all over again. And for even the pastor, there's a level of frustration that can develop, and they're not equipped and they aren't knowledgeable about OCD and how it manifests itself in a person who's suffering. So I felt it was really important to share my story about living with anxiety disorders as a Christian and a Christ follower, but in particular about OCD because it's so misunderstood, and in particular about scrupulosity OCD, because when you go that direction, people are even more inclined to think it's a spiritual issue.
Right.
And even the sufferers themselves really, really struggle. They can even know they have OCD and they accept it about all the other kind of themes and obsessions that they struggle with, but for some reason when it switches over to their relationship to Christ, then it's a spiritual issue. And so I, in the book, explain why it's not, and that OCD is OCD no matter what the theme. The treatment approach is the same.
Right.
If there are things you don't understand, which is very possible about your walk with God, that you can learn through the Bible, true, valid, real questions. In OCD, that can even happen because we're all at different places in our walk with Christ. You can still learn that thing, but you don't have to learn it 50 times.
Right.
So that's when you know it's OCD. It's like if the answers don't suffice, if the anxiety isn't satiated and laid to rest with the answers that are logical, reasoned arguments, it's OCD. And especially if you have OCD, you can pretty much be sure. And so I wanted to lay that all out, my own journey, because I felt that there's probably a lot of people with this struggle. If a Christian, a believer, a follower of Christ has OCD, there's a good chance that it's going to go that direction in their life at some point.
Right.
Because OCD always goes after what's most precious to you. And for the Christian, their walk with Christ is the most precious thing of their entire existence. So it's going to go there. And I wanted people to understand they weren't alone. But I also knew there were a lot of people like me who got all the way to 50 or 25 or 30, 40, whatever, and didn't even know that that's what it was. And I thought by sharing my story, they could discover that the way I did and get directed towards the help they needed. And that was important to me. And the other aspect of it is just growth in it through that. Before I go there, I did want to add to what you said about ways that the church can support people with, these issues, these different kinds of anxiety disorders, or all mental health issues as far as that goes. And I think the number one thing they do is listen and then validate the experience as a real affliction.
Right.
And not merely a spiritual issue that can be fixed by more prayer, more Bible study, more faith, but to literally be willing to support people and say, hey, this is a real medical or mental health issue for which you can get help. And we want to encourage you towards going to your doctor and starting that process. We want to encourage you that if they say you should see the specialist, to go ahead and do that. And we want to encourage you that if they suggest medication might be helpful to you, by all means, please do that. Because it's so harmful to say things like, well, it's a lack of faith, and taking medication means that you aren't trusting in God, and all the things that you can hear. it's so harmful, and it's such a, I don't even know how to describe what I'm trying to say. It puts up such a roadblock.
Right. It just makes the problem
Yeah,
worse.
yeah, and it hurts people, and it's
Mm-hmm.
important for churches to be able to be compassionate, encourage, pray for the person with a mental health issue in the same exact way you pray for anybody who has any other type of health issue.
Right.
Treat it the same, validate it instead of turning it into just a spiritual issue. And so I wanted to say that, is what the church needs to do.
Yeah, I think that that's so important and so helpful because we have this ability to rally around people who have just had a baby in the church. We're really
Yes.
good at that. We can bring you a
Yeah.
casserole, and we're really good at rallying around somebody that's going through cancer or has lost a loved one. But then when it comes to something that's invisible, like an anxiety
Yes.
disorder or OCD, it's like, well, we almost like people don't know what to do with that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. They either don't know what to do with it, or they've kind of bought into the stigma. And I've tried to kind of sort that out. I don't know all the reasons people don't believe in the validity of mental health issues, but I suspect that part of the reason might be just a fear of mental health issues, because of, like, when I was really young and I was first starting to experience these mental health issues to the point where they were debilitating. All I could think of was, I'm going to get locked up in an asylum. So there's these visions and pictures that people have of what it's like, or what people are like who are crazy, that
Right.
sort of thing. And so there's fears around stigma of what it is, to struggle with any kind of mental health issue. And it's sad because there's so much help out there, and there's so many people in the churches that are sitting in the pews who have mental health issues, and you wouldn't even know that.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely. It's huge. So, as we're getting towards the end here, at the end of every show, I like to ask the guests to share a story of hope, since this is called Hope for Anxiety and OCD. So, this is a time that you've received hope from God or another person.
okay, there's lots of stories I could tell, but I'm just gonna, because there's been so many things, and I get notes from people all the time about how the book has led to them for the first time discovering this is what's wrong, and finally getting the help they need. So that's how God's used my experience, where you comfort one another with the same comfort you yourself have received from God, which has been very humbling.
Right.
To me. But for me, I don't even remember how I knew to read this book, but I picked up a book by a person called John Bunyan that he wrote in 1666. And it's called Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners. And Mr. Bunyan's story resonated with mine in ways I could not have believed as I read this book about his experiences with, really what he had was OCD scrupulosity.
Wow.
When you read this book, it is just absolutely eye-opening. The struggles, the back and forth, how it debilitated him, how it crippled him, how he would be trying to even preach later on a sermon, and the intrusive blasphemous thoughts would just be blaring in his head, and he was so terrified they were going to come out of his mouth right while he was preaching, and it just crippled him. And he tells this whole thing, and it's so interesting to read, because it's like, yep, oh yes, that's what it was like for me. But at the end of his account in this book, he says, he admits that this thing was an affliction,
Right.
that God had allowed in his life. It was an affliction.
Mm-hmm.
And the very next thing he says is, God, use his language, God doth order it for my good.
Mm.
And then he gives this list of all the ways God had used this to grow him in his faith. And even his account of how he learned to to just accept the uncertainty of the thoughts and to press on in his choice to venture all for the sake of Jesus Christ was ACT, basically.
Right.
I mean, it was like, this is amazing. And I'm thinking, God knew that I was going to read that book. He wrote it in 1666. And God knew when I read that book, John Bunyan's story was going to encourage me, and it would show me something. It would show me that this affliction has a purpose. And the last chapter of my book, I share the purpose in my own life, and that chapter is called Purposeful Affliction. And I just, one of the biggest ways I've changed in how I talk about my anxiety disorders and in my OCD in particular, is I used to kind of go along and say, well, I have OCD, but God can still use me in spite of it. And that's kind of how I worded it.
Right.
Now I say, I have OCD, and God is able to use me because of it.
Wow.
And that's because of the ways he's grown me through this experience of affliction. That's not uncommon. Paul talked about it.
Right.
Talked about his thorn in the flesh. He said, God said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. My strength is perfected in your weakness. And Paul ends up saying, I'm going to glory in this affliction because of this. Because when I'm weak, I'm depending on God's strength and not my own. And so God uses these things in ways perseverance, empathy, allegiance, the things that I learned through my OCD, and particularly my OCD scrupulosity. It's just amazing. But reading that book, that was just literally a godsend. And you think about it, they didn't even know what OCD was back then, but God laid it on John Bunyan's heart to write that account.
Write about it. It's incredible.
Write about it. And so 1666 to, when I'm 50 years old, here we are, and I'm like reading this book, and I'm like, this is amazing. It just shows that OCD's been around for a really long time. It's not a new thing.
Right.
It's just that we now understand, what it is, and there's help and there's hope. And everyone who is struggling with this, I just want them to have the chance, to understand what it is and how to get help. And especially for my brothers and sisters in Christ.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So
it's your story and just what you're doing and just being vocal and open about being a very strong Christian who has also had a struggle and an affliction, I think is so hopeful to other people, hopefully, who will hear this podcast. But what we're talking about with church leaders, that's such my passion and desire, is that people would just get it,
Yes.
However they get it, whether they get it through listening to a podcast or reading your blog or talking to somebody with a personal struggle. It's just like, I just want people to be able to sit with people in pain and say, we're here for you.
Yes. Yes. And
it's so huge.
It is so important. And it's important to understand that it is painful. I mean, like you called it invisible, and it is.
Mm-hmm.
I would still get up every day, go through the motions like a robot sometimes. I would fix my hair. I would, put on my makeup. It was difficult to go out when I was really, really sick, but I still did it. I mean, I would sit in church and be tortured because of my OCD, but I would sit there.
Yeah.
And sometimes I'd want to run out, but you can't see it, but it is really debilitating. The only way you could see it on me was I would get really skinny,
Mm-hmm.
I would get quieter. I would withdraw, I probably didn't smile and laugh much, those kinds of things, but it's very, very painful. For me, definitely has been the thing that caused the most pain in my life and the most long-lasting pain.
Right.
Because it can just hang on and hang on. And I mean, I went through one whole pregnancy with it,
Mm-hmm.
And then in between, and then another whole pregnancy, I still had the same thing going on.
Right.
So that's how long it can hang on.
Well, if people want to dive in and read your whole story, will you tell us the name of the book? And I will put a link
Sure.
to it in the show notes as well.
Sure. The name of the book is Strivings Within the OCD Christian, and you can find it on Amazon. If you just write that in, and even my name, you can look up my name, Mitzi VanCleve. And that's the main book I have out there. I do have another book that's not really about what we've talked about as far as OCD today necessarily, but it's another direction I've been going, and it's a fictional book, kind of fiction with a little bit of my experience mixed in as a teen.
Okay.
And that was about what it was like to have like social anxiety. And it's written in a fictional form. And that one's called, that's terrible. That's In Your Dreams. That's the name of that one. That's also on Amazon. But it's kind of a nice book for teens who struggle with that type of anxiety, social anxiety. It might be relatable to them, in a story form. It's just a story about a girl trying to go to high school and trying to fit in and be normal, and the social anxiety is always shoving her back down, and so I want to try to work on those kinds of things too for teens, but I haven't been very dedicated with that lately. So,
well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story. I really
thank you, Carrie. I appreciate the opportunity anytime I can share, not because of what it does for me, but what I hope it might do for someone else who's looking for answers, looking for hope, looking for someone who can relate, to it, to what they're going through. And also, like you said, for the church and for pastors and people in leadership positions to understand better what these disorders are, what they're like, and how they can help. So thank you.
Ever since I did this interview with Mitzi, I have been really pondering this idea of growth through affliction in our lives. I hope that you chew on that one for a little bit too, because there are so many different things that God uses that are hard to go through, and yet they grow us closer to Him, they grow us closer to other people, and they shape our character in ways that we might never have received had we not gone through those difficulties. I hope that this podcast has encouraged you. If it has, will you do me a big favor and tell a friend? There's probably someone in your circle of influence who needs messages that will help them reduce shame and increase hope. And that's what we're all about on this show. So thank you so much for taking the time to listen today. Hope for Anxiety and OCD is a production of By the Well Counseling in Smyrna, Tennessee. Our original music is by Brandon Mangrum, and audio editing is completed by Benjamin Bynum. Until next time, may you be comforted by God's great love for you.